Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Into the Infinite. I'm Charlie and I'm so grateful that you're here. So, I want us to talk about inner critics today. Because why? Because that's how we break down things that stop us from moving forward. Technical terms, always. So, I was thinking about this. So, how do you move past your inner critic? Well, first, you recognize that that's the big question, right? How do we recognize that we're operating from a place of inner critic as opposed to inner power? That might be a title. So, future me, um, but when you're operating from your inner critic, what I think can happen, so there's several things that kind of happen at one time with this process of the inner critic emerging and becoming a more dominant voice. Now, when you're predominantly in a low vibration or lower frequency, when I think of this, so when I talk about that, what I'm talking about is the Map of Consciousness by Dr. David Hawkins, scientific study about using muscle testing and I guess measuring the frequency of specific thoughts. So when you're mostly in lower thoughts, which is, like shame and anger and frustration and upset and depression not as a mood disorder, depression as a lower mood. So let's make that distinction very clear. But when you're in that lower vibe predominantly, that is also the voice that you take on inside. So it's really hard to take on an inner champion when you're in a lower vibe because it matches, right? So your inner critic and like you're not going to have like an inner critic that's like good job. That's not what an inner critic is. So when I'm talking about the lower vibe, I mean when your inner critic is active, that tends to be indicative of not just fears and whatnot, but also the vibration that you're operating at. So that's really important to remember too. The vitriol with which your inner critic speaks tells you pretty much where you've been at. Is it shame? Is it anger? Is it frustration? When I heard the term I think it was righteous indignation in a video from Souls on Fire TV, that YouTube channel, and it just like it didn't like, it was paradigm shifting for me because I realized that should almost be its own part of that map of consciousness with where we are at collectively right now. And that was important. But what I'm talking about here, going back to that point about the inner critic, is that it is really the sum of the beliefs that you keep thinking over and over and over, which is just a thought that you keep thinking over and over and over. So a belief that you think about is something that anchors itself in things like ego through jealousy or guilt or, again, shame, projection, all of that stuff. And so if you're in a low vibe, you're also picking up the pieces. My cat is fabulous and she's been trying to get my attention since I got home. So we're going to leave that. She just knocked something over in the background. So the inner critic is really just the sum of the beliefs about yourself that made up your dominant vibration around people. That's what it is, right? So if you think that you're no good, if you don't think that you're good enough, if you think that you're incapable of doing something or that you do not deserve it, you will attract situations and people that will reinforce that. Why? Because their attitude towards you and their behavior is the most comfortable. So it's really hard to get comfortable with something else because that's where you're at all the time, right? So there's that piece of it. And then also, if you're in a lower vibe, you pick up pieces of the frequency of others, right? So the frequency that they're at, you pick up on because it becomes a sort of way of mutually reinforcing beliefs that you both share. So the moment that you start to disrupt those beliefs, it makes it really difficult for them to hang on to theirs. So it sort of creates this little ripple effect. And that's where you find, I've found this before, where I change a belief fundamentally inside, and sometimes people will leave my life. And and I had my dashboard record this note while I was driving today, but when people let you go and or leave your life, what they and you are leaving behind isn't a person, but a shared vibration that informed relationship with them and how you know one another. So that's really an important distinction to make here in terms of the inner critic, because the quote, there's a quote that says, the 5 people that you spend the most time with become who you are in 5 years. I think it was in Jack Canfield's book, The Success Principles. I'm sure Tony Robbins has talked about it, Zig Ziglar, Bob Proctor, a lot of the, big like sales and self-improvement guys talk about it. But picking up on, the vibration of others. It's the dominant vibe you've held and the sum of, your 5 people. But then I thought also your 5 beliefs. So the 5 people that you spend the most amount of time with, think about that too. And I'm not talking about blaming them, because at the end of the day, the cool part, the third part that I'm going to talk about here, is that it's your responsibility, right? You're responsible for your vibration. It sucks and it's hard sometimes, but that's how it is. It doesn't suck. It's actually awesome. It's empowering. What am I talking about? Like, to find out that you're ultimately in control of whether you are reduced or elevated by situations and people, that's awesome. That's power. So the dominant vibration that is held by the group of people that you spend the most amount of time with, if that's, there's a ton. I recommend looking them up. You can Google it, Map of Consciousness, Dr. David Hawkins, and you'll see how they level out. And again, this is a scientific study, so there's a lot of research that went into this. So you're basically the sum of the 5 people you spend the most time with, and also your 5 beliefs. So the 5 beliefs that you hold that are the most consistent in your life, your vibration and what you're pulling towards you in terms of circumstances and situations that reinforce it, are there to tell you more about that, right? So I use the example. So I've been shifting out of that kind of low vibe place from last year onwards, and I found a lot of different situations that used to be or could be very triggering, and there are certain situations that are appropriately just not great, and you have to label them as such, and then that way you can move past them. But one example was, having COVID, and it took kind of a turn for the worse before it got better. But then within a week and a half, I had a concussion that was pretty rough, and a bunch of other things at the same time. And I thought about how I was framing it in terms of asking for help with it and trying to manage it. And instead of just letting yourself be a victim to it, you're sort of empowering yourself in place and saying, I am going to articulate the truth of what I need, because that is the vibration that I'm moving towards. That is the vibration that I want to be my most dominant one, is one of optimism and hope and the capacity to reach for all of those things, despite what's happening around me, right? So when I was at the hospital, after I had closed the trunk and it kind of clipped my head a little bit, I needed staples. It was an interesting experience. I laugh now because it just was funny to me, like who that, I don't even know. But I remember sitting in the hospital and thinking to myself, there was a time where I would feel really hard done to by this, but I just was laughing. I was laughing with the nurses at the hospital and the doctors at the hospital, because I kept thinking, well, can I microwave food? Can I stand beside the microwave with the staples in? Like, finding the higher octave of it, because ultimately it's still happening. And if it's the result of something like a lower vibe thing, then just let the thing play out. You don't have to participate in the making it unfold differently, other than just observing it differently and responding. It's the response, right? Louise Hay talks about how it is your responsibility, your ability to respond to situations. So how are you empowering your response to situations? Now, this comes into play with the inner critic, because when you start to when you start to take in information about your inner critic in this way, it stops to be the dominant thing, like the thing that sort of controls you, that, makes you decide. It stops to be a deciding factor in how you are going to reach for something, and whether you are or whether you aren't. You're not going to think to yourself, well, why is this happening to me? Why should I go for that? Well, I don't know. You kind of shift into a different headspace with it, right? And ultimately, this is another thing to keep in mind. So I guess this would be 4 or 5, point 4 or 5, is that your inner critic is designed to protect your inner child. Your inner critic is designed to protect your inner child. What do I mean when I say that? Well, so for those who grew up in environments where your things to do with your inner child carried into your adult life, let's put it that way. Because it can be a number of things. It doesn't have to be just, heavy trauma. It can just be that you didn't get a need met, so that kind of carries forward into an inner child. So doing shadow work to address it is really important, right? But I think that because it protects that child from further harm, right? So what you perceive to be harmful, your inner critic will tell you not to do, and it will talk you out of that every single time. Why? Because it's trying to protect that inner child until you tend to it, and until you start to develop a relationship with it, to really care for it, and to, I want to say, I don't want to say take it to the next level with that, that part of you, but to really love and nurture and forgive yourself and others in that. So what I've found is that the voice of that inner critic, so how it speaks to you, is indicative of your dominant vibration. So where you're at on that map of consciousness, you know, and you picked up the vibration somewhere, but you can change it, right? This is the accountability piece. You need to own it, because whatever it is that makes it important to you. So it could be comfort, right? It could be that it provides you a sense of safety, right? You don't have to do things, because if you do, then it's scary. So we need to hide, right? That's how it works, right? So it serves you somehow. So taking responsibility for it allows you to pull back and to really see how it served you. And that way you can let it go. That way you can just say, thank you. I really appreciate that you protected me and did this for me. Maybe write it a letter. That's what I had to do with mine a couple years ago. This was before the map of consciousness. I didn't know about it. I knew about it more in terms of Abraham Hicks' emotional guidance scale, or the scale of emotional guidance. But the map of consciousness is a really great tool. But this inner critic, I wanted to put this out there because, I mean, it doesn't matter whether you're doing something that's like specifically like fine art, or if you're just a content creator, if you're creative in any capacity, if you're putting something out into the world anywhere, your inner critic is going to potentially run rampant. And it's important, in my opinion, to know where that is vibrating at, because that tells me. So it's sort of reverse engineering healing, because you're looking at what vibration it's been at. Then you're looking at where you've been at in terms of that, where that comes from regarding your beliefs. And then you can address the belief and how that inner critic and that specific way that it operates has served you. Then it's so much easier to let it go. In some ways, it's almost like the Wizard of Oz, where they pull back the curtain and he's just there, and then it loses all of its steam, right? It still comes up in different circumstances, but the way that it does shifts and invites you into a new level and layer of healing within yourself. So I think that you can make new choices, right? You can make new choices, and you can do different things in order to free yourself from the vitriol of that inner critic. And that inner critic can manifest into behaviors as well, like perfectionism, being chief among them. I mean, being primary among them. For me, that is a huge one, right? It has to be just perfect, because then people can't criticize me, because I've already done so much work to criticize myself before it ever reaches the world, that it just feels so scary to think of another layer of thing to worry about, right? That's something I've really had to work on. And I think that maybe that's for somebody out there to take and run with, because that's, it can show up in different ways. But the reason why I say to use the map of consciousness is because if you look at the map of consciousness and it allows a sort of pulling back from a more neutral place. So you're not adding an emotional charge to this process when you see it active in you or in the world around you. So predominantly though in you. I mean, when you see it in the world around you, it's really where you pick up on where your comfort zone is. And I say your comfort zone because your comfort zone doesn't challenge you. Your comfort zone doesn't push you to grow into, a new person, and not new person as in like shedding all the old. I'm talking about really starting to build new beliefs that support you and encourage you. Because once you start to do this, you'll find that the inner critic starts to go a little bit quieter, and your inner encourager, your inner cheerleader starts to really find their ground. And for those of us who have had very little of that nurturing growing up, I grew up with a family that was, it was more so light teasing and mocking and, jabs and making fun of, I'm only joking, right? That kind of thing. And you would find out information through that. So you would find out information very indirectly. And you'd always kind of have to guess. You'd have to guess based on your interpretation of that thing. And it's okay. I mean, I've made peace with it, and we've all made peace with it, and we're at different places, but that was kind of the environment. And it was also my parents weren't, I had a lot of freedom when I was younger, but there was always an expectation to do well. And do well, I mean, in school and, different ways like that. But I think that's important. And I think as well that I had a lot of opportunities that my parents and grandparents didn't, right? So I think that played into it as well. So it wasn't that there were these like super high expectations and everything was pressure. It was really just that, the search for information became really hard and you had to look to other people's reactions because there was a sort of mistrust that would build up within yourself. And everybody has stories like that. It's not like, oh, my childhood was so much worse than anyone else's. No, we all have things like that, because what we pick up on when we're kids, we are sponges, right? We are sponges, and in ways that our parents can't even imagine. So yeah. But all of this to say that if you find that your inner critic is kind of running rampant, these are hopefully some tools that will help you, and hopefully some tools that help you to transmute that inner critic energy from a place of doing a little bit of shadow work, but also at the same time alchemizing the things that made the inner critic so appealing as an option, right? So may you find freedom in this. It is something that I've had to do. And that I still find myself doing at times because the work doesn't stop, right? Like your inbox never empties. We think that we get to this place and we're like healed and it's done. But what we actually end up finding is that there's no, like, healed is not really a destination, because that would be like you're like at that point, I don't know, some people might fight me on this, but at that point you'd be dead. Like if you're just perfect and everything's done, what is life, right? Like, and I'm not saying that you need hardship to identify your life as there and present and vibrant and full. I'm saying that we're always doing some kind of healing and some kind of work on ourselves. And that's just how life is. We're always unfolding. We are works in progress, friends. So be gentle with yourselves as you go through this. And I wish you only wonderful things and the utmost healing and as much joy as your heart can handle, and then some, and then some. Why? Because it lights you up. So I hope that this was helpful. And if it was, do share, do like and subscribe. I would love to have you on the channel on a more permanent basis. So you can always undo that if you decide later. But if you want to join, it costs you absolutely nothing. So I don't know why you can't even see. It's more appropriate. Yeah, there we go. But anyway, take care. Have a great evening, day, or morning. No, evening, afternoon, or morning. Wherever this finds you on the time-space continuum. Take care.